Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried beneath centuries of imperial silence? What if I told you that behind the golden gates of one of history's most powerful empires, a tradition so disturbing existed that it was deliberately erased from every official record? Tonight, we're diving into the shadows of the Ottoman court to uncover a truth so unsettling that it remained hidden for over 600 years. Before we begin this journey into darkness, if you're fascinated by the untold stories that history tried to bury, smash that like button and hit subscribe. Your support helps us continue unearthing these forbidden tales. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love connecting with fellow truth seekers around the world. Picture this: Constantinople, 1598. The morning mist clings to the Bosphorus as a young girl awakens in chambers more luxurious than most could ever imagine. Silk tapestries line marble walls, fountains whisper in courtyards filled with exotic flowers, and servants attend to her every need. This is Princess Mihrimah Sultan, daughter of one of the most feared rulers on earth. At just 14, she possesses intelligence that astounds court scholars, speaks 5 languages fluently, and composes poetry that moves hardened warriors to tears. But this morning is different. Today marks exactly 6 months before her wedding day, and with it begins what Palace Whispers called the breaking. You see, what I'm about to tell you isn't found in any official Ottoman chronicle. These records were deliberately destroyed, hidden away, or written in code so complex that their true meaning remained locked away for centuries. What made Ottoman princesses different from other royal daughters wasn't their privilege, it was their curse. While European princesses might fear political marriages, Ottoman daughters faced something far more sinister. They underwent a systematic process designed not just to prepare them for marriage, but to fundamentally transform who they were as human beings. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, commanding armies that struck fear into the hearts of kingdoms from Vienna to the gates of Persia. At its peak, this colossal empire controlled trade routes, dominated seas, and ruled over millions of subjects. But perhaps its most closely guarded secrets were not military strategies or diplomatic negotiations. They were the rituals performed within the walls of Topkapi Palace. Within those walls existed a world unto itself. The imperial harem housed over 1,000 women at its height, each following strict protocols that governed everything from how they walked to how they breathed. Foreign visitors marveled at the luxury, but they never witnessed what happened in the deeper chambers, the places where no outsider was ever permitted to enter. The women of the harem were divided into a complex hierarchy. At the bottom were the newest arrivals, often slaves captured during military campaigns or purchased from distant markets. These women, torn from their homelands, actually had something the Sultan's own daughters never possessed: hope. They could rise through the ranks, catch the Sultan's eye, even become powerful queens who shaped the destiny of the empire. But the princesses? They were born into golden cages, their fates sealed from the moment they drew their first breath. They were tools of diplomacy, human contracts to be signed and sealed through marriage. And to prepare them for this role, the empire developed what can only be described as a systematic program of psychological conditioning. Let me take you deeper into Mihrimah's story, because what happened to her reveals the true horror of this hidden tradition. 6 months before her wedding, she was moved from her childhood chambers to a special wing of the palace called the Preparation Quarters. The official name was beautiful. It translated to Garden of Readiness. But the women who worked there had another name for it: the Place of Unmaking. Here, Mihrimah's education took a dramatic turn. Gone were the astronomy lessons, the poetry recitations, the debates with scholars that had once filled her days. Instead, she was handed texts with titles like The Duties of the Obedient Wife and Surrender as Sacred Art. Day after day, she was made to recite these passages aloud, not just to her tutors, but before groups of concubines and palace servants. The psychological impact was calculated and devastating. Imagine being a brilliant young woman accustomed to intellectual discourse, suddenly forced to repeat phrases like, "My thoughts belong to my husband," and Silence is a woman's greatest virtue, until the words became automatic, until they replaced your own thoughts. But the conditioning went far deeper than mere recitation. Mihrimah's daily routine was restructured around what the palace called exercises in humility. Twice each week, she was required to serve her father's concubines, women who had once been slaves, helping them dress, arranging their hair, even cleaning their chambers. The message was unmistakable. Even your father's former slaves rank above you now. The young woman who had once commanded respect from court scholars was now learning to bow at precise angles, to measure her steps according to strict guidelines, to keep her eyes downcast in the presence of any man. Her vocabulary was systematically reduced. Complex words were forbidden. Philosophical concepts were replaced with simple responses. Yes. Thank you. I understand. Forgive me. Any resistance brought swift punishment. A questioning glance might result in a day of enforced fasting. A sigh of frustration could mean confinement in the reflection chambers, small, windowless rooms lined with mirrors where disobedient princesses were forced to stare at their own faces while reciting pledges of obedience for hours on end. The most disturbing aspect of this conditioning was how it twisted religious practice into a weapon of control. Prayer, which should have been a source of comfort and strength, was transformed into a daily reinforcement of submission. Mihrimah was taught special prayers that praised wifely devotion as the highest form of worship, that described resistance to a husband's will as a sin against divine order. Even her physical environment was designed to break down her sense of self. The chambers where she now lived were filled with tapestries depicting idealized scenes of submissive wives celebrated for their silence and fertility. Mirrors were positioned strategically so that she could never escape her own reflection. A constant reminder that she was always being watched, always being judged, always being shaped into something other than what she had been. As the weeks passed, those who knew Mihrimah began to notice disturbing changes. The princess, who had once laughed freely, now smiled only when directly commanded to do so. Her voice, once clear and confident, became barely audible. She stopped asking questions, stopped expressing opinions, stopped showing any sign of the curiosity that had once defined her. Palace physicians recorded these changes in their journals, though they used euphemistic language. They wrote of achieving proper feminine temperament and successful cultivation of domestic virtues. But between the lines, a more troubling picture emerges, one of a vibrant young mind being systematically dismantled. 3 months before the wedding, Mihrimah's conditioning entered its most intensive phase. She was moved to the bridal pavilion, an octagonal structure in the palace gardens that was supposedly designed to represent purity and spiritual preparation. In reality, it functioned more like an isolation chamber. Here, every aspect of her existence was controlled down to the smallest detail. Her meals consisted of specific foods believed to promote docility. Certain herbs, diluted wines, preparations that some palace records suggest contained mild sedatives. Modern analysis of surviving recipes from palace archives hints at the use of substances like valerian root and poppy extracts, ingredients known to induce calm and reduce resistance. Her daily baths became elaborate rituals of symbolic transformation. She was immersed in waters perfumed with oils that the court claimed would make her pleasing to her future husband. But the ceremony itself seemed designed to reinforce the idea that her body was no longer her own property. Attendants would chant prayers over the water, asking for the bride to be made pure and empty, ready to be filled with her husband's will. The walls of the bridal pavilion were decorated with scenes from the lives of legendary wives, all celebrating women who had achieved honor through absolute submission. But these weren't just decorations, they were teaching materials. Mihrimah was required to study each image, to memorize the stories they told, and to explain how each wife had achieved perfection through surrender. Perhaps most cruelly, her isolation was designed to sever her connections to anything that had once given her strength. She was forbidden to see her childhood friends, her beloved tutors, even her favorite servants. Letters from family members were censored, with any words of encouragement or expressions of concern carefully removed. She was allowed to see her parents only during brief, formal visits where conversation was limited to approved topics. The young woman who entered the bridal pavilion still retained traces of her former self, but as the days passed, those who glimpsed her during ceremonial appearances reported a shocking transformation. Her eyes, once bright with intelligence, had become distant and unfocused. Her posture, once confident and regal, was now perpetually bowed. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to speak in the third person, referring to herself not as I, but as your daughter or the bride. 2 weeks before her wedding day, Mihrima underwent what palace records called the final instruction. The exact details of this process were never recorded, but surviving fragments suggest it involved elaborate rehearsals for the wedding night itself, conducted with anatomically correct dolls crafted by artisans and overseen by elderly attendants who had supervised countless such preparations. These rehearsals were designed to remove any element of surprise or spontaneity from the marriage union. Every gesture, every response, every expression was choreographed in advance. The goal wasn't to prepare Mihrima for a loving relationship, but to transform her into a perfect vessel for her husband's desires, capable of fulfilling her duties without question or resistance. The wedding day itself dawned with all the splendor the Ottoman Empire could muster. The streets of Constantinople filled with celebrating crowds. Musicians performed, dancers entertained, and the air was thick with incense and excitement. To the outside world, this was a fairy tale wedding between a beautiful princess and a powerful commander. But behind the public celebrations, a darker ceremony was taking place. In the private chambers of the palace, Mihrima was undergoing final preparations that bore little resemblance to the joyous traditions most brides experience. She was bathed in special oils, dressed in garments so heavy with jewels and fabric that they restricted her movement, and given what palace records describe as calming drafts to ensure her compliance. Her husband, Mustafa Pasha, was a battle-hardened general 25 years her senior. For him, marriage to a sultan's daughter represented the pinnacle of political achievement. The union would grant him access to the innermost circles of power, vast wealth, and unshakable status within the empire. Whether he understood or cared about the cost of this achievement to his teenage bride remains a mystery lost to history. When the couple was finally brought together in the marriage chamber, witnesses reported that Mihrima was barely responsive. She moved when directed, spoke when prompted, but showed no sign of independent thought or will. The brilliant young woman who had once debated philosophy with court scholars had been reduced to little more than an ornately dressed automaton. The aftermath of the wedding night was recorded in the private journals of court physicians, though their language is coded and euphemistic. They wrote of treating the new bride for nervous exhaustion and melancholic vapors. They prescribed herbal remedies for sleeplessness, sudden fits of weeping, and what they described as an aversion to masculine presence. In modern terms, we would recognize these symptoms as severe psychological trauma, but in the Ottoman court, they were seen as unfortunate but necessary side effects of the marriage process. The important thing was that the union had been consummated, the political alliance secured, and the princess successfully transformed from an independent young woman into a compliant wife. Mihrima lived for another 37 years after her wedding night. Palace records show that she fulfilled her duties as expected, bearing children, appearing at court functions, and maintaining the dignity expected of her position. But those who knew her before her marriage reported that the vibrant, intelligent princess had effectively ceased to exist on her wedding day. Her children grew up with a mother who was physically present but emotionally absent. Her husband advanced steadily through the ranks of the empire, eventually becoming a grand vizier, but he too seemed haunted by what had been done to achieve his success. Some accounts suggest he turned increasingly to wine and opium as the years passed, perhaps unable to face the daily reminder of the price paid for his political advancement. Mihrima's story was not unique. Palace archives, when they can be accessed and decoded, reveal that similar preparations were conducted for dozens of Ottoman princesses over the centuries. Some adapted better than others to their transformed lives, but all paid a heavy psychological price for the empire's marriage policies. What makes this historical tragedy even more disturbing is how thoroughly it was hidden from the outside world. European diplomats who visited the Ottoman court wrote admiringly of the educated, accomplished princesses they met, never suspecting that these women were living under a level of psychological control that would shock modern observers. The empire's ability to maintain this deception speaks to the sophistication of its control mechanisms. The public face of Ottoman royal marriages was all ceremony and celebration. Foreign guests saw lavish weddings, happy couples, and what appeared to be a refined, civilized approach to dynastic politics. They had no idea that behind the silk curtains and marble walls, young women were being systematically broken and rebuilt to serve the empire's needs. As I've researched this story, I've been struck by how relevant these historical events feel to modern discussions about autonomy, consent, and the ways societies can disguise control as tradition. The Ottoman Empire justified its treatment of princesses through religious and cultural arguments that probably seemed reasonable to many people at the time. They framed psychological manipulation as spiritual preparation and systematic conditioning as proper education. But when we strip away the elaborate justifications and beautiful ceremonies, we're left with the stark reality of what happened to young women like Mihrima. They were born into privilege, but denied the most basic human right, the right to remain themselves. Their minds were treated as property to be reshaped, their personalities as obstacles to be overcome, their individual desires as problems to be solved through careful manipulation. The empire that created this system ruled for over 6 centuries and left behind architectural marvels, artistic treasures, and legal innovations that we still admire today. But it also left behind stories like Mihrima's, reminders that even the most sophisticated civilizations are capable of systematic cruelty when it serves their political needs. What happened to Ottoman princesses forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of power and the hidden costs of empire. How many other historical traditions, celebrated in textbooks and tourist guides, concealed similar systems of control? How many young women throughout history have paid invisible prices for the political achievements of their fathers and husbands? These questions become even more pressing when we consider that the systematic preparation of Ottoman princesses wasn't ancient history. It continued well into the modern era, ending only with the collapse of the empire itself in the early 20th century. This means that some of the last princesses to undergo this conditioning lived to see the invention of radio, the automobile, and the airplane. They inhabited a world that we would recognize as modern in many ways, yet they endured psychological manipulation that belongs to the darkest chapters of human history. The story of Mihrima and countless other Ottoman princesses serves as a reminder that progress is never inevitable and that the most beautiful facades can hide the most terrible realities. It challenges us to look beyond the official narratives and ask uncomfortable questions about the systems we admire and the traditions we celebrate. As I close this investigation into one of history's most carefully hidden secrets, I want to leave you with a thought that has haunted me throughout this research. If the Ottoman Empire could successfully conceal these practices for centuries, what other secrets might be buried in the archives of the world's great powers? What other stories of systematic oppression have been disguised as romance, tradition, or political necessity? The voices of women like Mihrima have been silenced for far too long. By uncovering their stories, we honor their memory and ensure that their suffering wasn't completely meaningless. We also arm ourselves with the knowledge needed to recognize similar patterns of control, whether they appear in historical accounts or modern institutions. If this story has affected you as much as it has affected me, please share it with others. History's most important lessons are often its most uncomfortable ones, and stories like Mihrima's deserve to be heard, discussed, and remembered. Hit that subscribe button if you want to join me in uncovering more hidden truths that the powerful would prefer to keep buried. And let me know in the comments which other historical mysteries you'd like me to investigate. Together, we can continue pulling back the silk curtains of history to reveal the human stories that lie beneath. Because only by understanding the full truth of our past can we hope to build a better future. One where no young woman will ever again be broken in the name of empire, tradition, or power. The shadows of Topkapi Palace have kept their secrets for centuries, but today we've brought one of those secrets into the light. The question now is, what other truths are waiting to be discovered in the darkness of history? Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next investigation.